Good afternoon and welcome. It's a pleasure to have you all with us for the inaugural Matraszek Fellowship Lecture. It's a real pleasure. I'm going to say a few words about Jonathan in a few moments, but I'd first like to welcome Mr. Matraszek here with us today. It's your generosity which makes the which is now supporting not only the lay academic fellowship here, but more of the academic life of the house. We're very grateful to you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. And it's a pleasure to have you here and some old friends here. Mr. Matraszek is a graduate of Magdalen College, Oxford, and has many friends here. It's great to have you with us. It's also a pleasure to have the Reverend Michael Langridge with us, President of the Pusey House Trustees, and even we have a retired President of Trustees in the back. Good to have you both with us. Welcome. Part of the charism of Pusey House is to hold together the study of theology and other academic disciplines with a life of worship and discipleship. In some parts of the world, even to our great surprise perhaps, in the university, there exists an idea that knowledge is more true the more it's kept apart from questions of faith and religion. We inhabit a tradition which sees more profound understanding made possible by the illumination of faith and divine light. In this tradition, faith in the word and wisdom of God is a kind of virtuous illumination which brings more light to all forms of knowledge. Before Dr. Price came to Pusey House, we had a significant focus in our academic work on theology in particular, but less so on questions of the great questions of the day, culture, politics, law. And Jonathan, since his arrival, has helped us to organize the academic life of the house in a hub, the Center of Theology, Law and Culture. And again, we're very grateful, Mr. Matraszek, for your support of this work, the work of the Center of the Theology of Law and Culture. And I want to say a couple of words of Jonathan. It seems right at this point to say that there'll be an email sign-up sheet going around because Jonathan particularly likes that we don't miss any opportunity to have people join. Here we go. I'll send it around. I'll leave him send it. Start to send it around. There we go. If you'd like to learn more about lectures like this one and the work of the Center for Theology, Law and Culture, please add your name to the email list or your email. A few words about Jonathan Price. Dr. Price is, before becoming the lay academic fellow at Pusey House and the Matraszek fellow, he was an assistant professor at the University of Warsaw, also a junior research fellow at Blackfriars next door. He was the program director of the Human Rights in Europe project, the American journal First Things, which is particularly relevant to the topic of the lecture today. He's a PhD from Leiden in the philosophy of law, and he has developed a significant European as well as North American network, promoting and bringing together groups to study the great political and cultural questions of the day. And the topic of rights and persons is very much a focus of your ongoing research, and we're very much looking forward to hearing what you have to say today. Thank you.
Coming when there are many things on offer here in Oxford. I see friends, I see colleagues, I see students. I told them there was no obligation, but apparently they didn't believe me. So thank you also for coming. And I see people who've helped along the way. I would like to first thank you again, Marek, for this gift and for the provision that we have here. Before we had this provision, we were supported by John and Daria Barry, and so I was the Barry Fellow, and we continued that pretty seamlessly into the Matraszek Fellowship while still working with Barry and with the Canterbury Institute in Oxford to do these sorts of things, traditional scholarship in the traditional register, seeking truth humbly. That's the model of the scholar. So we see this as a transition and a continuation of something that Barry helped us get started and now has been put into the safe guardianship of Mr. Matraszek's beneficence. Dominic Burbage, I think will be here if he's not, there he is, he's been a light in Oxford to help many young people see that they can remain in the university and do the kinds of work that had traditionally been done here. The trustees of the chapter of Pusey House with Michael Langrish now and Father Robin earlier have trusted me and Father George in the chapter to do the kinds of things we're doing, to extend this work out further than we had, to go out beyond the remit of theology with a capital T. And very grateful. The greater chapter are the people that set up the room, keep the lights on, like the light bulbs fixed for us, make sure the loos are provisioned and everything else, and hope someday to be the vocational interns, hope someday that all this turns into parish life well organized in some English vicarage, and we hope that for them as well, so thank you. Professor Boudewijn-Sirks is the person who introduced me to the Roman law and to Oxford in terms of the law faculty, and he was at All Souls College, so I got introduced to that as well, which is a brilliant place, and I'd like to thank you for that. My doctor father was Andreas Kinneging in Leiden, who introduced me to European intellectual milieu coming out of Yankeedom to these places, and gave me the wonders of the tradition. I'm almost done. Brian Lapsa, who might be here, has been a great friend who's made things happen. Thank you. And yesterday would have been the 80th birthday of the person who originally invited me to Oxford, and that's the late Sir Roger Scruton, without whom Mark and I wouldn't have met. We were introduced by him, and without whom I wouldn't have come to Oxford. I met him here in 2003, and came in 2006, and then 2010 finally, and I haven't left. And then my wife and children, who tolerate me being absent for long stretches of time from Warsaw, which is kind of technically home. It depends whether you ask the tax man or my family. I pay taxes here, and I stay there. We're live streaming, so I guess the Polish tax officer can interrogate us if they want to. Without further ado, I'll say the lecture. I'm going to start with the evening prayer of this house, which has a line: "We remember Dr. Pusey, who contended with his life and learning for the truth of the Incarnation. The Incarnation is the doctrine of God becoming a man in the person of Jesus Christ, and personhood is the theme of this lecture. In Latin theology of the Incarnation, beginning with Boethius' treatise on Contra Uticum, so in the 5th century of our era, the Greek apostasis, or a dignified substance, has been rendered as persona. Formerly, persona was a juridical term, a term of art in the Roman law, and before that, just the word for a theater mask, which has its equivalents in Greek earlier, prosopon, and perhaps even back to the Etruscan. All that the theologically inflected persona was to bear would become the conceptual link between God and man. Both were persons. This teaching I'll call Christian theological anthropology, the classical Christian theological anthropology. So today I want to begin by first suggesting an argument toward, but not yet for, a conclusion that I believe is imperative regarding the history of the development of person. That is, it was believed by the persons, the premises and the conclusions were believed to be true, and that there was a soundness to the argument. So, the logic was there, and there was a soundness, and that's one of the reasons why we've seen the kind of legal, historical, ethical development of the person. That's the buried assumption here. And I want to argue towards something, but not yet for it, that I believe is imperative, and that's persons are natural. By extension, the rights of persons are as natural as the persons themselves, since they are little more than a redescription of what is, or part of what is meant by person. I'll argue towards something that I myself am not capable of arguing for. I'm only a bit of a philosopher, so you philosophers who are here will have to take that up if you like the direction I'm leading you in, and I hope someone does. There's not enough good philosophical anthropology or Christian philosophical anthropology out there, so part of our project is to take this up. Then, as more an historian of ideas, I'll offer one great historical example of what taking both the conclusions and the implication of the argument seriously has looked like in our tradition. One way of explaining the remarkably similar developments of private law in canon, civil, and common traditions is that this Christian philosophical anthropology has been the efficient cause of the developments. That's the suggestion of the argument, that in the background you have a sort of a kind of seed that flowers in certain ways, and we've seen a very long flowering of it from its early Roman law deposit to the baptizing of that, to its movement in and out of secular philosophy, theology, and law up to our present day. So my point of departure, persons are natural. They are features of nature, a natural phenomenon. As natural as granite, electrons, koalas, storm systems, the seasons, or the cosmos itself. They're even as natural as the beings that exist as their most common instance. That is, the human being, or the human animal, as we often now speak of that being today. You are a person, I am a person. Almost everything that concerns your life and flourishing is the result of relations between persons. Yet personhood is said to be a mere social or psychological category, a fiction in both senses. That is, something that's made and something that's known to be false, an illusion, an evolutionary mistake, at very least a construct, perhaps useful for all kinds of things at times, but not in any way, or not in the most important ways, natural. That our natural sciences seem unable to see the person, even denying its existence, by an insistence, and I think at times a prejudice really, for bottom-up and only bottom-up accounts of all things should give us pause. For person is the way we articulate all of our social relations and our social reality. Even as animals, it's the way we articulate it. Now the word person isn't necessary for this. The conceptual framework of person will be necessary. Obviously, some cultures don't have the word person or an immediate cognate for it, or have 10 words that might actually cover the concepts that we have in person. And so that's neither here nor there philosophically, because concepts are ultimately what we're talking about. Those who are persons enjoy a place at the table. Those who are not, do not. We might eat them or kill them without necessarily doing wrong. Person is also, in this way, a shield and a status. When someone insults you deeply, you may reply, and some of us have replied, "You can't do that. I'm a person." Person here is operating as the opposite of any thing or any being treated as a thing, lacking reason, intention as a thing that could be bought or sold or owned or disposed of at the will of someone else, of a person. So the opposition that's set up is persons, things. But person, more than a psychological and social reality and a moral status shield, it's also importantly for my argument towards certain conclusions, it's an exact term for the presence of reason in the world. It's an exact term for the presence of reason in the world. When we say person, we mean there is reason in the world. Wherever reason is found, persons have been. This is famously the argument that Paley appealed to for a divine creator in the analogy of the watch found abandoned. But I think even more is meant whenever we recognize reason in the world than just the source in someone of order, rather than in some other thing. That is tracing back something to smaller bits or earlier bits. We say, okay, we found a watch in the woods, someone has placed this here, someone has made it. And I think something more is meant. By reason, what is meant, I think, and implied is more logos, Greek term logos at least. And logos is a broader term than the Latin terms that fill in for reason, because it implies words, implies story. Logoi implies story, it implies a constitutive element. When Christ is talked about as the logos of creation, it's that red line going through it. It's a source and it's a destiny in some way. It's this constitutive element. So I think what we mean when we see reason and we see person has that, everything that we mean by that, our language, our informal and formal logic, our storytelling, our biographical elements of life, and the ordered parts of our effectual life, the reasoned passions, as it were. Not the parts of us that we say are mostly animal, but the parts of us that we recognize are only present in the beings that we describe as persons. This is something like what Elizabeth Anscombe was getting at in her book Intention, 1957 book in Intention. Person is an answer to the why of everything that cannot be accounted for without a certain kind of intending, intentional action in the world. It's not the only way to answer it, but it is the way we commonly answer it. So I'll pause now that, as it's suitably straightforward and not yet particular enough to become manifestly specious. And again, this is an argument towards something, not for it. Philosophers can take that up. I said persons are natural, but I didn't say much more about natural. Nature or natural can mean many things, and Boethius treats this in his treatise Contra Uticum. If you haven't read it, it's a really good treatise that gives us person in Latin from the Greek, deals with the equivalent Greek terms, and deals with different meanings of nature, because he defines person as the individual substance of a rational nature, and he deals with each of those terms. At least 5 meanings of natural or nature could be all things in the world. So the natural sciences study the cosmos, so anything within the cosmos. Things outside of that are not nature, not able to be touched by it. The second meaning is something that is not made by us. So it's an opposite of artificial, right? Something that is what it is without any obvious intentional activity having made it so is considered natural. 3 is the Aristotelian or classical definition. That's the specific difference that makes a thing what it is. So the nature of cats that makes them cats rather than dogs, we talk about as a nature. 4 is the good or function of a thing that makes it a representative of its kind. So it's a nature of a watch to tell time. And without that, it wouldn't have the nature of a watch. And that's a good, not just a thing, but it's often a good in the strict sense that it's judged to be positive in the world, without which the thing couldn't be what it is. And 5th is a byword for good action or the good thing. Water is a natural form of hydration. Matraszek is unnatural, and there's judgment implied there. The fallout of nature, or the follow on from nature in the 2nd sense, something not made by us in the 5th sense, that is something good, something that has a goodness about it that might require action from us. So if matricide is unnatural, we probably should avoid killing our mothers, if at all possible. And the fallout of these, at least for rational beings, would seem to be that the nature of a thing will set limits on what can or should or must be done to or by it. Because the implication is always something about persons that Thomas Aquinas only tells us at the very end of his treatise on persons. He says, person implies dignity, which Boethius had buried in his text. This is question 29 of the first part of the Summa. And he says person implies relation. What he really seems to mean is you can't have a world in which there's only one person. You can't have a world in which there's only one person. It's a bit like having a language which is only known to one person. That there's something about the character of it which doesn't allow it to exist in an instance of only one. Okay. Now the last bit on this is, that was the last bit. Now that was gesturing, that was throwing a lot out there. I do think there's some deep truth in this position that persons are natural. The rights of person are an extension of it, of that naturalness. So where you find persons, you'll find these rights, and you'll have to take them seriously in the relations amongst or between them, or else things will go terribly wrong, which is what we call history. Mm-hmm. Right? That's our name for when things go terribly wrong is simply called history. That's why hell is very interesting to write a book about, but heaven's not so interesting, right? You know, because things going wrong between the relations of persons is what we expect to happen, and what does tend to happen when things go right, we don't really know what to do or say, right? So, have you ever read an interesting book on heaven? It's the least interesting part of Dante's Corpus, in my humble opinion. But he's known for the Inferno for, I think, good reason. But the question is this now. Imagine if we took this arguendo and said, fine, Jonathan, we'll follow you down this garden path. What might it look like if the argument were taken seriously and its implication followed over time in what would become a sophisticated moral legal order? That's the question here. Okay. In contemporary scholarship, there's a question that asks how old are things that we like? You know, kind of look at ourselves and say, you know, we have rights. How old are they? How far back do we go? Like that type of question. It can be a very interesting question. Sometimes it's just, chasing something that can't be found. But sometimes it can't be answered easily historically for all kinds of reasons. That question, how ancient are rights, which is currently being dealt with by some very clever persons, including Benjamin Straumann, who's at Zurich, and has written a number of books on this that I encourage you to read. But, you know, it's not until the concept of right was articulated, in distinction at least from rights and obligations under civil law and privileges granted by human society, or what we might call customary rights, that such a question even really makes sense. So to start to ask the question is already to start from the point of disambiguation of a number of things, and then to look back and say, you know, it's like if you had granite and you were able to separate granite out into all its parts and say, where does this bit come from? But you never find that bit in nature unless you've taken it all apart and have that bit in your hand. So it's very hard. It's very, very hard to do that. And so the question, scholars have understood this, and they've gotten used to asking questions like, is modern liberty ancient? That's the kind of question that we'll ask. Is modern liberty ancient? He thinks, for reasons that aren't quite the same as mine, that it is. He thinks it's ancient because he sees ancient Roman liberty in some ways as synonymous with what Grotius does in his texts and what we end up doing in modern human rights law. I think it's casting the net too wide and too deep into history, but our disagreement at that point is one of what the addition of Christian philosophical anthropology is to the recipe. That's where the difference is between us. So if you want to, he's got a nice book called Roman Law and the State of Nature about Grotius. I recommend it. It's an easy read, and he's a good scholar. So I answer yes to the question, is modern liberty ancient, as Straumann does, and point to the ancient doctrine of natural liberty as evidence. Then there's still a question, just how ancient, and I'll answer in its doctrinal form, but not in some nascent form or some suggestion or like in the Hammurabi Code or something like that, but in its doctrinal form as articulated. I think it's at least as ancient as the Christian treatment of the Roman law by Emperor Justinian. And I say at least as ancient. I'm perfectly willing for someone to show me a text before that brings to bear the same doctrines. Justin brought them forth as law. So it's as old, in other words, as the developed Roman law of persons, specifically the parts of the persons pertaining to free men. So the natural liberty is the assumption, the development of what it might look like inside the law is what free men can and cannot do in the Roman law. My contention will be, wherever you first find the person, there you'll find the source of modern liberty in its ancient form. Often referred to first as natural liberty or natural right, and then developed into a system of liberty for the persons possessing rights or liberty within the law, for who or what else other than persons could possess liberty or rights. Now, liberty or freedom, when you hear those words, do they sound modern or ancient to you?
Both.
Both. Who said both? Someone said both. Oh, yeah. We got one both. We had lots of moderns. I didn't hear did anyone say ancient? No. Right? So they sound, and they even sound a little bit American to us. Yeah? Or Mel Gibson's freedom in a kilt in Braveheart, or like they sound to us modern and anachronistic when they show up too early. But in fact, it's where the ancients, or at least our ancients in the civil tradition, and many of the ancients in the common law tradition, under Christian leadership, began their discussion of law. And I want to meet the civilian ancients just at the locus classicus. You have handouts, and I'll refer to them from time to time now, and now they'll become useful for putting some flesh on the skin of this. So let's go ad fontes. The Institutes of Justinian, promulgated between 533 and 35, were not only a textbook for the aspiring jurist, they also had the force of law. They were a treatment of the Roman law as received by Christian rulers and Christian institutions. Thus, as law, they were promulgated in the name of our Lord Jesus Christ to the youth desirous of studying law, having been compiled from all the institutions of our ancient jurists and the common cases and from many other legal works. That having been done, so the res gestae, we've given these institutes the fullest force of our Constitution. And note here that we're in 533, 535. These institutes have arrived after 1,000 years of legal development of the deposit of law in the 12 tables. We're about 1,000 years into Roman law by this point. The modern student of law would recognize the major division of law that is present in this text. However, there are statements about the nature and purpose of law that might surprise her. In Book 1 of Persons, under the first heading, Justice and Law, one reads, and you have this, from here you have many of these statements on your sheet, one reads a statement that would be more at home in Aristotle's or Cicero's ethics. That is, justice consists in the perpetual wish to render everyone his due. Then, as if drawn from an ancient treatise on politics, jurisprudence is the knowledge of things divine and human, the science of the just and the unjust. The things divine and human, the science of the just and the unjust. And once again, the maxims of law are a classic case of practical ethics. To live honestly, to hurt no one, and again, to give everyone his due. Immediately following this, the study of law is separated into two branches of public law and private law. Public law regards the government of the Roman Empire, private the interests of the individual. Private law consists of precepts belonging to the natural law, to the law of nations, and to the civil law. And here, the introductory part ends, and the natural, common, and civil law are described in their generalities. Humans are first classed amongst the animals here, with the law of nature, which is that law which nature teaches all animals. The example is given of a law that applies to humans alone, but which is also a particular instance of a generic fact of animals. Marriage is given. Natural sexual reproduction in the union of male and female, which we term matrimony, it's quoted, hence the procreation and bringing up of children. The law that, quote, a people makes for their own government belongs exclusively to that state and is called civil law. So we're starting to divide these out. There's a lot of tension and contention about here, which we'll see in a moment, about the relation between the law of nations, the natural law, and how it feeds into the civil law in Justinian. And there's maybe more merging of the natural law and the jus gentium, or the law of nations, than we would recognize in, let's say, post-scholastic thinking on natural law. But be that as it may, I'll try to disambiguate them a little. The law of nations is that law which natural reason appoints for all mankind. And because all nations make use of it, it obtains equally amongst all nations. Via the law of nature and nations, the people of Rome are governed by laws common to all mankind, and by civil law, they are governed by their own laws. So these divisions are standard fare, again, for the modern lawyer. The harmony of the parts of the sources of law is then suggested. However, immediately, just soon after this, a conflict of laws is presented, along with the standard revolution to this notable, important, and ancient conflict. The necessities of human life are said to be the reason for the accrual of the law of nations. War is implicitly included amongst the necessities, as well as what follows from wars. And what follows? There's a descriptive statement which is offered of the emergence of slavery. Wars arose, it says, and from their train followed captivity and then slavery. Presumably this is referring to the ancient practice of offering captives who were not ransomed to become slaves rather than to be put to death. Prisons as we know them, 3 hots and a cot for the duration of time or up to one's natural life, were unimaginably expensive before modern labor-saving devices were invented and energy was routinely available by cheap sources. The victor in war had a choice to free the captives or to do away with a freshly conquered enemy. The desire to have a certain peace might lead him to choose the latter, that is, unless the enemy could be made useful to him and his polity. Thus, the practice of captives being offered or made to become slaves emerges as preferable to killing them or allowing them to live and returning them home to fight another day against you at some point in the future. So, the next section I've called Born Free Yet Enslaved. The same sentence in the Institutes that introduces slavery as a byproduct of war concludes by saying slavery is contrary to the law of nature, for by that law all men are originally born free. Likewise, it introduces this as present in the law of all nations, established by reason somehow related to the law of nature, because there is a merging and a participation of the law of nature and the law of nations. But contrary to the law of nature, for by that law all men are originally born free. Likewise, it also lists purportedly positive practices that have been instituted by the law of nations, including almost all economic activity, contracts, buying, selling, letting, hiring, partnerships, deposits, loans, and return in the kind. So these are listed alongside one another as two things that emerge everywhere and at all times, and that we can all participate in, because as rational persons, we've come to the same conclusions about them, and we don't need to all be Romans or all be Persians in order to have certain kinds of contracts with one another, certain kinds of relations, and to understand that slavery is a practical necessity that might be able to curb the law of nature. The claim that slavery is part of the law of nations and free birth is part of the law of nature means that the laws have two different and competing origins with perhaps concomitant levels of obligation attached. Whereas, quote, the laws of nature, which all nations observe alike, are established by divine providence and remain ever fixed and immutable, the law of nations, however, have accrued over time by nearly universal consensus of the nations of the world. Any direction that the law of nations has taken, therefore, could be reversed slowly but surely as individual nations begin to determine their own laws against the consensus. So the way out of the law of nations, which is universally conceded, it's universally supported, is to start to object and do your own civil law differently. If others and enough do it, then the law of nations will change. There's nothing that's fixed and immutable about the law of nations. It's like a shared denominator between all of the nations, whereas the law of nature is fixed and immutable. At this point in the Institutes, the great tension between naturally free birth and conventional slavery is apparent, and it must be apparent to the people who are writing this. When the civil law of persons has been introduced, at least it will be introduced shortly after this, at least a third of which will be laws pertaining to slaves, their masters, and those who have relations to them. Such laws are the general conclusion of the law of nations, but expounded in precise terms as a fully fledged civil law for the Romans. The law of persons, however, begins by stating that all our relations are either to persons or to things or to actions. Persons are treated first, and the reason for this priority of the person, a phrase that John Finnis has given us in a lecture, in a great chapter by that name, is stated, "It is of little purpose to know the law if we do not know the person for whose sake the law was made." That's end quote. The positing of the person as prior to the law, whether historically or in this case it seems logically, or both, begins a tradition of reflection on the foundations of law and constitutional order that will culminate in a refounding of the legal science on the rights of the person, and this will be a consensualist or a necessarily contractarian refounding. So that's the swap that will be made. The law of persons, which was part of the law, will become the cornerstone and the foundation of the law. And contracts and consensual relations will therefore become much, much more important in order to determine what is obligatory or possible or constitutional. Anticipating the significance of this emphasis on the person, bear in mind the supra-legal status of the individual human being in contemporary human rights law. For instance, the Universal Declaration of 1948 has replaced older justifications for constitutional powers and for the monopoly of violence in the state with the prerogatives of the human being as person. This aside suggests how native to even the earliest Christian reception of Roman law are both the consensualism and the natural liberty that will eventually be developed as early modern and eventually modern jurisprudence. Both follow the priority of the person, the ancient and the modern, that Justinian affirms at the outset of his didactic legal code. Now, I've gotten ahead of myself, right? I've shown you the end. I've gotten to the end, and now I need to get you there from where we are. We're still with Justinian, and we have a few steps to go, and a few pages on your handout, and not a lot of time. So, not all persons would yet receive their prior natural liberty within the law. In fact, most wouldn't. Only those really with a patrimony would. Right? The law of persons really ends up being a law for the paterfamilias, as articulated. Everyone else is under someone's power and articulates their relation to society in large part through the paterfamilias. We immediately learn from Justinian that the chief divisions of the rights of person are this, that men are either free or slaves. Freedom is offered as the motivating concept then, and it's defined as the natural power of doing what we please. Limits are placed on it, on what is prevented by force or by law. The chief institutional prevention of freedom by law, and where necessary by force, is slavery. Again, an institution of the law of nations by which one man is made the property of another, but which is explicitly said to be contrary to natural right. So, the old kind of question, then whence natural liberty? You know, because eventually we're going to have natural liberty everywhere, within and without the law. And the status quo ante is going to be the place we'll return to when civil society falls apart, is a state of nature in which we are naturally said to be free. Natural liberty, with its correlates in the human free will, is a concept that emerges as an independent concept, I think, in the Latin West in Augustine's thought. There isn't open borrowing of it here, but I think that's where we get it. Because natural liberty is a byproduct of free will, and natural liberty are talked about as byproducts, as we'll see in the Grotius quote that comes up. The full sense of the free will, either as a power of choice, the power to choose good or evil, or the power to choose the good, has partial precedence both in Aristotle's understanding of voluntary action and certain Stoics' appeal to free decision and self-action. But it's only after Augustine fully distinguishes the will both from reason and from any passions that doctrines related to the relative freedom of the will remain part of magisterial Christian theology. And this will continue up to the early modern era and beyond. Both Anselm of Canterbury, who wrote on this, and Thomas Aquinas are conduits of the doctrinal affirmation of the free will and define it roughly along lines that map with Augustine's philosophical and theological anthropology. Now that's true and necessary, and it's a part of the story. We don't want to lose sight of it. But what I don't want to lose sight of here is the specific deposit of a doctrine of freedom within the Roman law itself, which, even if it doesn't come back into contact with the theology until much later, is important and contributes to a lot of what we mean by modern liberty. So that was present at least since Justin promulgated it. And it's existed somewhat independently of the theology of the world Latin Christianity before and after the time of Justinian. We've said this, and I want to use the text now to illustrate it. Freedom has been with the law for nearly as long as it's been with Christian theology, both as a value and as a goal. It's noteworthy in the Institutes of Justinian that you have before you that they indicate not only the fact of freedom of all persons, both natural and for some also within the law, but that freedom should be striven for wherever possible. So those who fall outside of the category of free men should also have freedom striven for. Despite the great curbing of natural liberty by the formal institution of slavery, the tendency in the institutes was to extend freedom. There might even be said to be a formal bias in favor of achieving natural liberty or basic freedom in the manifold laws against unnecessary perpetuation of slavery, some of which I'll detail momentarily. As was already noted above, the law is claimed to be for persons. We call those persons of law, that is, pre-legal persons. This is a term of art in the analysis of this. They're not defined within the law, they pre-exist the law, and the law guarantees certain things for them, or some of them, civil protections for instance, as persons in the law. Right? So it ascribes a mask in the law that is the legal and public personality to what it recognizes as a natural personhood that's existing, whether the law is present or not, or wherever that natural entity goes. So you are yourself, you are David Campanelli, and in the law you're also called David Campanelli, but those are two separate things, such that if you were to cease to be with us and your massive fortune was to be taxed, it would be taxed as David Campanelli, the legal entity that continues to exist as a public face until the government gets what it wants, and then it declares you civilly dead. Right? So there's a way that these exist together as part and parcel to you, can exist separately, and can have a bit of a life of their own. But the freeborn man is the model of the person in the Roman law that we're busy with. And he's free from his birth, it says in Justinian, wherever both parents be freeborn, or both made free, so freed men, or one made free and the other freeborn. This is about the formal bias in terms of liberty. He also is freeborn if his mother be free, even though his father be a slave. And so also he whose patrimony is uncertain, being the offspring of promiscuous intercourse, but whose mother is free. Okay? Some favor here we see is shown to what are called persons of mixed birth, right? But what is more curious is how the passage continues to hope for freedom right up to the last minute. Quote, "It is enough if the mother be free at the moment of the child's birth, though a slave at the time of conception." End quote. All the more, the rule even allows that a child is born free if the woman was free at the time of conception and enslaved before the birth of the child. And this is held, quote, "on the ground that the unborn child ought not to be prejudiced by the mother's misfortune." We're finally told in this remarkable passage that Marcellus thinks, and Justinian agrees, that it is enough if the mother of an infant is free at any moment between conception and delivery for the offspring to be born free. So she was a slave at conception, she was manumitted, and then sold herself or was sold back into slavery. The child is born free. While it is not uncommon in civil legal systems after Justinian, so this is remarkable in a way. It's undoing the curbing of natural liberty, but it is a law of slavery ultimately, right? It is actually a law of slavery. I don't want to oversell this. I just want to indicate that there is the bad conscience of Justinian is exercising itself in part by continuing to agree with legal opinions that would put the onus on the side of demonstrating why someone should be a slave rather than why someone should not be a slave. While it's not uncommon, again, in civilian legal systems after Justinian for the prejudice to be on the side of freedom, I know in them of no assumption of perpetual natural liberty. That is, natural liberty as either a right or a principle, which cannot be interrupted by convention, to be found in the ancient sources or the canonists and theologians who later contributed to the development of the civilian tradition from the sources such as these institutes. What I'm actually suggesting is there were gestures toward natural liberty, serious and strong commitments to the priority of persons, heaps of classical ethics, but all of these stood alongside the defense and acceptance of conventional slavery as law, as permissible law. That is all the way through the scholastics, all the way through. There's open debates. There's a debate between Las Casas and others. There are debates about this, but the sense is nature has said this, and it is curbed for all kinds of practical reasons or convention, or because one could willingly sell oneself into slavery. That is until something happens, and that is the most important early modern inheritor of the whole legal tradition begun by Justinian, which was also perfected in the by the late scholastics, is Grotius, whose dates are 1583 to 1645. Grotius's variations on the older themes eventually rendered the natural promissory powers of humans, which I'll return to very slightly, premised on natural liberty, acceptable as contract doctrine for all the nations of Europe and much of the world today, particularly after the great codifications of European law in the 19th century. So that's his long-standing contribution, is contract doctrine. But Grotius largely affirms what came before him in scholasticism. He's not revolutionary in any strong sense. He's an ancient, and that's why his books are this thick, and mostly they have classical allusions and citations to bolster his point and add authority to his arguments. But Grotius largely affirms what came before him, while he also places God-given liberty at the center of his anthropology and of what becomes his contract doctrine, and his contract doctrine will become his theory of the formation of legal authority. That is where it's not already. You're out on the sea, you're at the East India Company, you meet some people somewhere. How do you move from here, of not knowing one another, to having something that can be called law? He has a way to describe this through our natural liberty and promissory powers. Grotius does this by extending a theology of divine liberty, which was popularized in his own day by Jacob Arminius. If you've ever been a Calvinist, Arminius is the bad guy. The bad guy. 5-point Calvinism is like the smack the smack of it. I heard a laugh here. The hand, the 5 points together, or the hand that smacks Arminius, and he and Gomarus famously had a fight, I think, in Leiden, where one of them was thrown into the canal by the other, or so we've heard. But so it's a point of contention. And eventually, Arminianism was condemned as a matter of state, the Council of Dort in the Netherlands, and it became formally forbidden to be preached. But Arminius was professor of theology in Leiden for a time when Gomarus was also there. And he was a contemporary of Grotius. And Grotius extends a theology of divine liberty, popularized in his own day by Arminius, so as to include man as totally free, in the same sense as God is totally free. Man is so free, in fact, that he should not be forbidden from rejecting what is in his own best interest here on earth, and not only in market relations, but full stop, or even from rejecting his eternal salvation. So the doctrine of irresistible grace would be the opposite of this position, which is resistible grace, that one can say no to it. So consider his locus, which you have before you, from De Jure Praedae, or the Law of Plunder, which was written between 1604 and 1608, just at the end of Arminius's life, circulated but not actually published until the 19th century. Only the chapters which you might know on the free seas, Mare Liberum, were actually published, that part of this work. What does he say? He says, God created man aut exousion, free and sui juris, so that the actions of each individual and the use of his possessions were made subject not to another's will, but to his own. Moreover, this view is sanctioned by the common consent of all nations. For what is that well-known concept, natural liberty, other than the power of the individual to act in accordance with his own will? And liberty in regard to actions is equivalent to ownership in regard to property. Hence the saying, every man is the governor and arbiter of affairs relative to his own property. And here he's obviously suggesting the law of nations. He's connecting natural liberty, which he knows, and everyone else reading this knows is from Justinian, to, and part of the Roman corpus, to the freedom of the will, and not the freedom of the will to do good, the freedom of the will to list and do as it pleases. So this is open freedom of the will, not the freedom of the will you find in Anselm, for instance. He then deliberately quotes the Roman law related to mandate, and I've copied that there for you to say what it says, because he suggests this to his readers. What says, the full quote would read, in the case of mandate, there is not only financial risk, with which the action of mandate most certainly deals with, but also the risk of esteem. Regarding one's own assets, everyone is master and judge. He does not all but most business as he pleases, but the affairs of others are managed with the strictest care, nor is anything which is in the management of these neglected or undone, is it free of liability. So regarding your own affairs, you're welcome to send yourself to hell, as it were. That's not what it says here, but it's mandate, but Grotius' interpretation. Regarding others, you're not. You exercise great care, great caution, unless you're given mandate to do so. Appeals to the same constellation of ideas are present in that are present in De Jure Praedae. They also appear in De Jure Belli et Pacis, which is important for us because that was the published work that became the most famous book of its day, and was, lots of books are said to be groundbreaking. But it was in many ways groundbreaking because it tried to give a natural law that was outside of Catholic moral theology that would allow you to interact with people that you didn't share much else with than your personhood, than your ability to reason with one another, which was a practical necessity when you were out on the high seas and you came across people that you'd never interacted with before and needed to know, and now where do we go? Especially if they don't want to join our church. What do we do? How do we relate to them? Okay. Grotius there says, for it is not the case that if something is useful or beneficial for someone, I'm immediately permitted to impose it on him by force, which is the original justification for certain kinds of authority by those who know in the polis, right? This is what you get from Plato, not all the way to NATO, but you get basically from Plato to relatively recently before Grotius' time, the sense that there are some who know better and know what's good for you, and that can be imposed on you by force, such as for the unity of the polis, for the promotion of the good, for good morals, for whatever. Because for those who have the use of reason, the choice of what is useful or not, or beneficial, must be free, unless some right of somebody else be established over them. Grotius implies in these passages and elsewhere that natural liberty or free will, that is, those who have use of reason, should be carried into the realm of permissible obligation, that is, what can be imposed on one by force. The longer version of the passage from the Europride indicates that this obtains not only for the person of law, so remember he says, God created man free. He's not talking about, he actually uses legal terms, but he's using it in nature. He's not talking about man in society or man within a legal order. God created man aut exousion, free in sui juris. I'll deal with aut exousion in a minute, which is probably not a term that's come up regularly in your discourse. It wasn't certainly in mine before I read Grotius. That obtains not only for persons of law, but also for persons in the law. Namely, natural liberty must manifest itself as conventional liberty, as legal liberty. And convention alone cannot blot out natural liberty just because it's good for someone, or expedient, or pragmatic. Saying that it's practical, that slavery emerges over time, says it's better for us to do this slavery than not to have it, right? And therefore we should have a law of slavery. The convention alone cannot blot out natural liberty, although you can consent to have your natural liberty blotted out. This is, to my knowledge, the first rendering of the doctrine of what I call perpetual natural liberty, that connects natural liberty in nature to the necessity that law supports as much as possible natural liberty of the person. Grotius's elevation of liberty follows in a tradition, again, of the late scholastics and some early modern Jesuits, Lessius chief amongst them, among whom there was a notable rise in the appreciation of human freedom, in particular in a theological idiom. Their project of what's been called by Professor Wim de Kock of Leuven, when he was in Leuven when he did this, early modern scholastic contract doctrine, was aimed at, quote, in his words, the restoration of the freedom of the Christian. One choice quote connecting this and illustrating what he's talking about is from Pedro de Oñata, a contemporary of Grotius, and he says this. This is parallel tradition within the Catholic Church that articulates freedom differently from Grotius, but there's a great amount of similarity between the two. In translation, God left man the freedom to take care of himself. God left man to take care of himself. He left it to man's will to bind himself when he wanted. Now, actions do not operate on the will and intention of the agents, but in accordance with their will and intention. Otherwise, man would not be the true and perfect owner of his goods. I put in there the Latin that was behind it. That is, unless he could give them when he wants, in whatever way he wants, and unless he has the additional capacity to enter into contractual obligations when he wants, and in whatever way he wants. Okay. Viewed in isolation from their contexts, in Catholic moral theology, and in a free will obsessed Protestantism, Grotius and Oñata, beginning with their shared difference from the Justinian heritage, wherein liberty was eclipsed by convention. They share that sense that liberty shouldn't be wholly convinced by convention. However, the difference between Grotius's God created man aut exousion, free in sui juris, and Oñata's God left man the freedom to take care of himself, will turn out to illustrate the substantial difference between a doctrine of perpetual natural liberty and one of circumscribed liberty. And Catholic moral theology is the constraints or the fence that makes the field in which liberty can operate in this construal as an analogical treatment. Whereas Grotius is one who says, you're not in any field, you're not bound in any way except by things that are explicitly forbidden by God or explicitly you're told to do, like to worship God. In everything else, you are set at liberty. Then, before the state of civil society, and once civil society is established. And notice we're dealing with state of nature, state of civil society, rather than state of nature, state of grace. So we've moved from state of nature, state of grace, the theological inflection, to state of nature, state of civil society, from Grotius onward. And some of the late scholastics were busy with this as well, but from Grotius onward, Hobbes will write 25 years later in a Grotian idiom about the same sorts of things. I'm going to have to skip a section where I tell you where all this comes from, and I get Theophilus and the Periphrasis and other things, and it's fireworks, but I'll have to post that somewhere, and talk about aut exousia, this term. Grotius deliberately uses three terms, autoxousia, sui juris, and liberi in the phrase. But autoxousia stands in for God's complete freedom in Arminius's disputations. He would set disputations for students. And autoxousia became the term for totally being put at free like God is. And hupexousios was the term for circumscribed liberty. So I would put onyata and certain Calvinists and Grenaeus particularly on the side of hupexousion, that God gives us a limited field of play in which we're put at liberty. That's why onyata talks about the restoration of the freedom of the Christian. So once you're within the fold and you're formed, you can be set at liberty. Love and do as you will. This is Augustinian, right? Love and do as you will. But love first, meaning being in Christ, being brought up. Grotius, God created you free and you stay that way. So autoxousia is the term that stands in for God's complete freedom in Arminius' disputations. The term itself has a curious provenance, as I suggested. And I think I just turned to the wrong place here. I want to tell you about it. Autoxousion is used when it's not used as an attribute of God, and it's applied to humans. It's used as being one's own authority. So, someone who's sui juris is someone who is at the age of majority and is able to be represented and to represent themselves before others in law. So, in nature, that would mean someone who's, an adult formed human being of some kind. So we're created such that we grow up and we become these sui juridical creatures before God and man. We're free, that's the other word, but autoxousion has the inflection on the point of authority. That is, in things that are not obviously wicked or obviously prescribed, so not proscribed and prescribed, you are the authority. When you pick up Grotius's law of war and peace, you get to a certain point where all you see is prudence, 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 right? So, you're told in war, there's three things you can't do. You can't rape, you can't poison water sources, and you can't betray near relations like familial relations of your enemy in order to win. And these are because these are the foundational things of society, the security of family, the security of food, and the relations of the family as it goes on. And if those are disrupted, then he thinks would result in total war. So those are always forbidden. Anything that's forbidden by the Bible, that's just God says no to, that's also forbidden. Everything else is a matter of prudence. Everything else is a matter of prudence. For who? For you. For you, for you, for you, for you. And that tradition is one of, there's not a confessional anymore where you're told whether the sin is of a high enough order that you should really do some things indeed to make it right, or whether you should perhaps just try not to do that again. So that guide isn't there of the confessional manuals that were had. Like, you got to pick them up. There was Mr. Badman. Mr. Badman was in confessional manuals of the late scholastics and on. Was a guy who was put through all these cases, this casuistic treatment, and what Mr. Badman did. Whether if Mr. Badman did X with partial knowledge, it would have been mortal sin, and so forth and so on. That's fallen away. It's not present. We don't yet have novels and literature that provide these kinds of moral reasoning for individuals. The way in the 19th century, perhaps in English literature, the confessional might have been replaced by Jane Austen having you think through social circumstances and what was fitting and right and wrong and whatnot for secularized Christians. What you have is the falling away in a generation or two of all of these constraints and guides and knowledge, and then someone like Grotius standing up and saying, but God made you strong enough that you have the ability to choose wisely. It's not easy. You have the ability to and the responsibility to, and it's put directly onto each person. I'm completely out of time. I was going to tell you that Scotland's the first place on the planet where this is realized, which is fascinating. You've got the text there. I'll post this lecture online, and the things that I said less well you can read through if you like. You'll humor me on that. But Lord Stair, the man John Dalrymple who became Lord Stair, was exiled to Leiden. before he was brought back and was made before he wrote and published the Institutions of the Laws of Scotland, which begin with their first principle, the first article on liberty. And Grotius is directly invoked. And it says basically anything that's not an obediential obligation or forbidden in Scripture, anything else is permitted. And then it goes forward to articulate the law of Scotland. And that's the first place I believe that perpetual natural liberty shows up as the law of a land and has been maintained and is still present in the Scottish legal code. And finally, by the time you get to Adam Smith and after the Scottish Enlightenment, Adam Smith looks around and says, what I see is the simple system of natural liberty. And it would do us well to very quickly, I'll just end with that quote, and which is on the last page of your handout, I think. All systems either of preference or of restraint, therefore, being thus completely taken away, the obvious and simple system of natural liberty establishes itself of its own accord. Every man, as long as he does not violate the laws of justice, is left perfectly free to pursue his own interests in his own way, and to bring both his industry and his capital into competition with those of other men or orders of men. In the version of this that I hope to prepare as a chapter and perhaps to find a home for, Justinian is connected eventually to the movement of this natural liberty of the person, this articulation of Christian philosophical anthropology into almost all areas of human endeavor by the end of the Scottish Enlightenment. And I mean, the terminology is even, a simple system of natural liberty. It's become something that is simple in its parts, when the parts are put together, is complex and masterful and does things that couldn't have been anticipated before. The very last thing, I met Matraszek is he's a theologian. He might still be with us, and I once had a class with him, and I asked him what heaven would be like, and he said, holy anarchy. He was very good with words. English was probably his fifth language, and so the double entendre was there. But where persons are found, if rights are also, and where persons are treated as natural goods that they are, not only does this holiness increase, but freedom does as well. To the place where holy anarchical relations between persons are all that might be needed to coordinate and direct their relations to an ever greater good. And here we have, I think, an intimation of a version of the peaceable kingdom, begun already in part by taking seriously God's creation of us all free, sui juris et non exousion, in a political and legal system premised on such natural liberty. I think that was kind of Grotius's goal when he was looking at this. A relatively low view of sin, relatively high view of the possibilities of human cooperation as creatures that like one another and were made by God to cooperate with one another. I'll stop there.
Fascinating lecture. You're brimming over with questions and really difficult things you want to bring up. Go ahead.
So I thought there was a tension that emerged in the definition of person in the lecture.
Will you speak up, please?
Sorry, I'll try to. And I wondered if you'd resolve it at this point. So it's a tension that I think has an importance as well for contemporary contract law. The tension between the radical freedom that you emphasise with Grotius's view, that freedom that mirrors the liberty of the divine, and the relational character of persons. And I think the way this works itself out in contemporary contract law has been in a series of doctrines designed to protect persons by limiting freedom of contract. So in equity, that's the doctrine of undue influence. In the common law, duress, and there have been statutory interventions like the Unfair Contract Terms Act.
Consumer protections.
Consumer protections, exactly. And it's all about seeing persons as they contract as part of a relational network which might influence them, and that being a justification to limit freedom. Which would you prioritise in those two elements?
So in a separate bit of writing on this called the imperfect realization of Grotian contract doctrine, I suggest that the doctrine was articulated, but never really wholly brought to bear on the law, because in some places where it was, like after the French Revolution, when one could marry and divorce at will, it was a tragedy, right? When this was brought to bear on certain kinds of civil law contracts or contract-like relations. However, in certain areas of law, where you don't have obvious harms that come from humans doing what they want to do, like gift giving. In modern law, gift giving doesn't have a tremendous number of limits on it, including regarding succession. In France, you still have the orphanage. A certain amount of the money needs to go to your children and be divided equally. But for the rest, you could give it literally to your dog, or to. And I think that those types of relations that say wherever possible, if the person who is the owner of the thing, by being the owner of his liberty, from says he wants to do this and it doesn't have an obvious harm, then we don't have a reason why we can say it won't be done and why we shouldn't facilitate it being done. And I think that's the one bias. On the other hand, because humans seem to be less coordinated and perhaps more sinful than Grotius understood, which we don't talk about as sin anymore. We talk about it as mistakes, error, limits of knowledge, etc. But we do talk about power, let's say more power hungry. Certain kinds of limitations have been put in place when there's an analysis of the parties as having grossly asymmetrical knowledge or power and this is famously why caveat emptor shows up, and why other things about the buyer beware and the seller informing also flip in English law and other places, because market relations reveal to us the increase of ordinary persons being engaged in lots of market relations, reveal to us places where we can't just say, okay, if you want it and we can't see why it's harmful, then do it, because we see 1 million or 10 million or 50 million or 1 billion such transactions and we start to see a real harm that we try to curb. And so there's a give and take here. The principle, I think, still is radical freedom of the person, and now corporate persons as well. Roman law doesn't have corporate personality in the way modern law does, but persons, either states, fictitious persons like Monsanto or whatever, Pepsi Cola, or, and natural persons like you and me that have a legal reality. But the tension's always there, and there's never been, to my knowledge, a time when full Grotian contract doctrine of natural liberty has been extended into the contract law of any nation, except in part during revolutionary governments after the French Revolution and after the Bolshevik Revolution.
So you don't see the modern development as a negative one?
No, I think it's probably necessary. I mean, I don't know that Grotius was correct about his philosophical anthropology. I tend to find in myself maybe more sin than he found in all of humanity, and so I'm maybe a little bit more worried about this trust in natural liberty. But I also like this vision of a peaceable kingdom ordered by mostly by our free choices.
I was curious about your term perpetual natural liberty. Is the perpetual component of that meant to encode the premise that man was made ab initio to be free from the beginning of time throughout the end of time, or is that to mean that at a certain point we have declared, for example in Scotland, that man is from this point onward free?
In civil law, I think it's historical. It was declared at some point, and before that point it wasn't the law. But Grotius seems to teach that it's ab initio, that this is the way God made us, and when we are what we're meant to be. So it's a teleological claim, because when you're a baby, you are born free, but that's not really what he means. What he means is the human being, developed into the adult that it's supposed to be, is born free and should be respected and facilitated in that freedom.
If I can ask a follow-up question, do you think that there's a connection, or is there something about this conception of perpetual natural liberty that lends itself naturally more towards deism, since a lot of the Scottish Enlightenment figures were themselves deists? Adam Smith, I think, probably wasn't, but he
notice that
borrowed
Smith starts using the word justice, offense against justice. By the time you get to Smith, it's not an offense against God or scripture or something, or the magisterial teaching of the church or moral theology. It's against justice. Does it lend toward deism? Not necessarily, because the intention of God to make us free, I think, is really important. modern human rights documents have a hard time justifying themselves because they talk about the gift and not the gift giver, right? But if we start to doubt the gift, the endowment, which is mentioned in the Universal Declaration or in the Declaration of Independence, eventually, if we lose sight of the intention of the Creator to make, Robert Bork III, then we find it hard to sustain the regime of such rights. So I think if it does tend toward deism, it will eventually come apart, or full-blown atheism, it will come apart, as it did in the atheistic regimes of the 20th century, which had no truck for human rights. They were not interested in human rights.
Christoph, thank you very much. Is it theologically problematic, and if so, how, to use the language of personhood for corporate persons?
I really like corporate persons. Some of my best friends are corporate persons. Is it theologically problematic? I mean, it comes from Christian ecclesiology. So if it's theologically problematic, then we broadly speaking, have done it to ourselves. Is it theologically problematic to take something that applies to maybe only one person, the church, body of Christ, and apply it to just any type of association? I don't know, but I don't know usefully, when it's absent, it's hard to usefully ascribe moral responsibility, blame, and reward at the right level. So, if there's no corporate personality, then it doesn't make any sense to pursue contemporary members of, state of Germany for things that happened when their grandparents were alive. And I think you get into a sort of methodological and metaphysically individualistic description of associations or communities as just collections of natural persons, which it doesn't ultimately, when Dow Chemical Corporation, this is not going to go online, I guess it is, but it's not going to say that. When Dow Chemical Corporation poisons my water and that harms my children, I don't say something like, damn you, board of directors of Dow Chemical Corporation that met on so-and-so day to decide not to have an inspection regime. I think I rightly say, Dow Chemical Corporation is the moral agent that is responsible for this and where the blame is laid. And the Communist Party of Russia or the Nazi Party or something like that, or the German state or the United States or whatever that entity is, we haven't been able to articulate well what that reality is, but absent it, it's really hard to account for the kinds of moral harms that associations and groups and families and other corporate persons commit, and the good they do as well. So, no.
You were going to say why? You were going to say why it's theologically complicated?
Well, a limited company isn't made in the image of God, some might say.
Some might say.
Do corporate personalities need to be made in the image of God is the question then. Okay.
And our
Probably
last
the last question, David. You've been mentioned already once.
So as it's the last question, I'll take you off in a different direction. You've been around a lot. You've been to Leiden, you've been to Warsaw, you speak to us with an Atlantic accent. And so I'm interested in your observation as to whether culture and national identity impacts these understandings of liberty. And given you mentioned Roger Scruton, his quotation of Leszek Kolakowski springs to mind. He said, in Britain, everything is permitted unless it's forbidden. In Germany, everything is forbidden unless it's permitted. In France, everything is permitted, even if it's forbidden. And in Russia, everything is forbidden, even if it's permitted. I just wanted to reflect on those thoughts.
The Anglosphere has, I think, been most ready to realize the sense you can list where you please unless it's forbidden, and the rambling paths that are still open in this country are one bit of evidence of it. And the comfort with an unwritten constitution and with common law jurisprudence is also part of this. There's been a lot more discomfort with it on the continent. I think the continent is much more hup exousiok. It's a circumscribed liberty, so it is possible when you have a license. Can you own a gun? Yes, if it's licensed. Can you have a dog in Holland? Yes, if you pay the Hondenbelasting. you know, the dog tax. Yeah, can you do this? So that is more contemporary Holland, contemporary Germany, contemporary continent is more regulated in that way. Although it doesn't seem to have been true of the Dutch of their golden age, and it doesn't. And in some places like Britain and other places where the free seas was pushed back by Selden, for instance, with the closed seas, there was also a different cultural prerogative. Maybe the question should be something like, that I would like is, are we talking about human persons, anywhere, anytime, any place, like humans in space, you know, or humans on Papua New Guinea, or if they were offered this and given this natural liberty as part of who they are, would they develop it? Would it develop in this way? Would it become something like we've seen? I don't think we really have an answer to that because we've only had 1 or 2 or 3 experiments in something like this. But it's remarkable how the various different cultures of Europe, the common law, the canon law, and the civil law, for all their differences, have developed very similar contract doctrines as this kind of deposit of the person has been realized in their jurisdictions. So culture counts in some way, but probably not enough to elide this once it's believed and once it's practiced as part of a sophisticated moral, political, legal order, like the common or canon or civil law. I didn't touch on canon or common law much here, but there's very similar developments within them.
In about 10 minutes, you're welcome to join us as we exercise our freedom as persons to return to God in whose image we are made in an act of worship and adoration. Are we a corporate person doing that, or a group of
Might depend. You know, our college is made in the image of God. So no, we have a choral evensong with some music from some Dutch music, some music from Central Europe, and a Polish anthem by a 17th century Polish composer. And our lovely choir, expanded to 10, will treat us to this choral evensong.
and a story of frogs and knowledge?
Yes, and Father George will preach on animals and plagues.
Again, Mr. Matraszek, thank you very much for this. It's wonderful to have you here for this inaugural lecture. Jonathan, thank you very much indeed, and thank you all for coming.
I'm